do some companies, some leaders, some governments, NGOs, why do some get through potentially catastrophic crises without any meaningful harm to reputation, to trust, to confidence, and to other measures of competitive advantage? And why do other companies, other leaders, other governments, other NGOs go through equivalent crises, but come out the other side with their reputation in tatters, with trust and confidence evaporated, with other measures of competitive advantage from stock price to employee productivity plummeting? I believe the difference between those companies and organizations that get through a crisis well and those who get through a crisis poorly is mental readiness. One of the patterns we find when we at the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership study crises is that it isn't the severity of the event that determines harm to measures of competitive advantage. You can have two companies similarly situated going through exactly the same kind of crisis at exactly the same time. One will come through it well and one will come through it poorly. The determining factor is the timeliness and the quality of the response. And one of the things we find is that what is necessary to assure a timely and effective response is mental readiness. Now, what is mental readiness? Mental readiness really consists of three different but related things. The first is emotional discipline. The ability to be calm and to remain calm, even in a very stressful circumstance, as others may be panicking and as others may be worrying and anxious. The leader needs to maintain calm. The human brain has a tendency to shut down critical thinking during periods of stress, but one of the disciplines of an effective leader is to find ways to remain calm even under very stressful circumstances. Now, Captain Chesley Sullenberger, the pilot who flew the U.S. Airways flight that had to make an emergency landing and ultimately landed in the Hudson River, was being interviewed by 60 Minutes and Katie Couric, and she marveled at how calm he remained throughout the entire flight. He confessed to her that it was a forced calm. Forced calm is okay. Forced calm works. We learn how to force ourselves to be calm through rigorous training and repetition. So, for example, firefighters are trained to walk calmly into a burning building, where every other human impulse would say, we need to run away from the fire. Similarly, soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen are trained to move towards the shooting, even though every other human instinct would say we need to run away from the shooting. The same kind of thing applies in corporate leadership and in leadership generally in getting through a crisis. One of the things we do at the Logos Institute is create war game-like exercises, crisis simulations, that run leadership teams through the kinds of circumstances they would otherwise need to face. And we do it with exaggerated, compressed timelines and really stressful decisions that have to be made in real time. What we find again and again and again from our clients is they report that the simulation itself was really difficult and really stressful, but they hope they never have to go through that kind of stress in real life. And the more they go through the simulations, the more likely they are to be able to maintain calm in the real circumstance. The second element of mental readiness is what we call deep knowledge. And that deep knowledge involves studying the patterns that exist across forms of enterprise and across geographies and across enterprise size. And what we find is that Organizations tend to behave in predictable ways. Human beings who are stakeholders of organizations tend to behave in predictable ways. And we can inventory the things that always work. We can inventory the things that never work. And we can inventory the things that work circumstantially based on what the particular issue or event or stakeholder may be. And we can harvest that knowledge to help us better understand in a timely way what is likely to work and not work. The other thing we can do is to study actual crises and harvest lessons from those crises without having to actually relive those crises. So we can harvest lessons without suffering the trauma, but use those lessons to help us recognize that things that will never work, we shouldn't even try. And things that did work will give us permission to take a risk that might otherwise be unpalatable. The more knowledge we have about what works and doesn't work, and in particular why it works and doesn't work, the more likely we are to make smart choices in the actual crisis. The third element of mental readiness we call intellectual rigor. Let me take a moment just to talk about rigor generally. Effective crisis management requires rigor, the same kind of rigor that we find in every other business process and every other management process. And one of the patterns we find that is remarkable is that otherwise gifted leaders who are rigorous in every other element of what they do, in the moment of crisis, abandon that rigor and they improvise and make things up, and it almost always goes very badly. Intellectual rigor means having the discipline to defer certain kinds of questions until we've addressed certain other kinds of questions. To defer the question of what do we do until we've asked, well, what do we have and what does it mean and what do we want and how can we get there and who matters to us and what do they care about. Intellectual rigor means considering certain things in a certain order. And the more rigorous we can be in the attention to what is happening, the more likely we are to actually figure it out and come up with a viable solution. Now, the better we become at these three elements of mental readiness, at emotional discipline and at deep knowledge and at intellectual rigor, the more likely we are to be able to come up with an effective response in a sufficiently timely way.